for. And it is largely our, practices to avoid, to suppress, or to escape difficult life tasks, difficult life experiences, challenging emotions, are, and challenging experiences that maybe mentally or physically, or emotionally. Usually it hovers around kind of mental, emotional, overload. And I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to talk about it. I want to move on. It can become, we start to use spirituality or our spiritual practices as a sort of crutch as a way of standing back, in the face of life's turmoils. It's kind of our way of stepping back, but using spirituality specifically, either our language or our practices. And the sort of the good news and the bad news, I guess, for lack of a better term, the irony of it is that we need our spiritual practices to move through difficult times. Whatever the spiritual practice is, whether it's you're walking in nature, you have a specific prayer practice or meditation, you might attend a particular spiritual community, or maybe you have a favorite ritual or ceremony to, whatever your spiritual practice is, we need those for the difficult times, and yet we can use them as a crutch. Althea Luna said, the reality is that not everything in life is love and light, as is the slogan for many spiritual seekers. Pursuing the light and living enlightened, raw, and deeply interconnected existences is also about setting yourself on fire. It's about creating an inferno of your false beliefs, illusions, and separating desires, ideals, and prejudices, which I think is a great quote. And it's just, that we do think of, I'm on this spiritual path, or I'm engaging in work to, to heal, in old wounds, to be the way I term it is to be my most noble self, right? So who doesn't want to be their most noble self out in the world? And yet we find at times that we can, in doing that, wind up sort of in a thinking or a bubble where everything is love and light and, smile and unicorns and pink frosting, and that's when our spiritual practices or our beliefs kind of become a crutch to avoid the reality of life. And so what she's saying is that to pursue light and to pursue and understand this interconnectedness of life, we actually need to set some of those things on fire. So, as already kind of mentioned, spiritual bypassing it's used as a defense mechanism to, as they say, ward off the gremlins and demons of our existence. And it will keep us from developing courage and being authentic and healing, expressing our wholeness and really just being authentically who we've come here to be. And the term I use is our most noble self, because I think regardless of someone's faith tradition or religion or life philosophy, the term most noble self, most people can wrap their brain around, whether you have whatever your definition or understanding of God, of the divine, of ultimate reality, right? Whatever term that is that works for you. So Viktor Frankl, he said in The Meaning of Life that what gives light must endure burning. So what gives light must endure burning. So when you hear that, here we're going to go back to the chat box for a minute. What do you think? What does that mean? What do you think that might mean? What gives light must endure burning. You didn't know I was going to make you think. Amber says, truth is sometimes painful. Yep. Healing and wholeness requires going through and acknowledging pain and trauma. Yeah, Janice says fire can be cleansing. I like that, Kathleen. It suggests a transformation process. Yeah. And if you want to obtain Michelle says, if you want to obtain higher consciousness, light, enlightenment, then some suffering or hurt or pain is essential along the way. Yeah, I use the term, when I'm teaching, when I talk about wholeness, I say that our joys and our sufferings are our wholeness, because even in our sufferings, there is, through those, we, find an expanded light. Yes, Rebecca says light involves pain. It's a crack in the darkness. Yes. Yep, and many of us have experienced a dark night of the soul, and certainly I know people that are experiencing it during, this pandemic. Not just a difficult time, but really a dark night of the soul. Yeah, we sometimes do get in our way, and we can suffer. So, and when I use the term suffer, so when I say, excuse me, our joys and our sufferings are our wholeness, I'm really, when I say suffering, me personally, I'm referring to pain that happens in life, as opposed to sort of, we have something that's painful in life and we kind of carry it along with us and sort of stretch it out, that which is what happens when we avoid dealing with the pain. So just as a point of clarification, when I'm referring to suffering, I'm really talking about pain. Pain and suffering are kind of synonymous when I'm using that term. All right. So let's stop for a minute here. I'm going to pause for a minute. Any questions or comments before I keep moving along? I know we're only 20 minutes, 15 minutes in. Okay. Excuse me. So here's what I'm going to do. I think, oops, sorry. What I'd like to do is, there's a new message there. Do you think the concept of suffering is hard in the West because we tend to view God or the divine only as love? That's a great question, Brian. So if you can't see the chat box, I'll say his question again. Do you think the concept of suffering is hard in the West, meaning, imagine you mean the Western world, Western hemisphere, because we tend to view God or the divine only as love? My answer, see, I can feel the teacher in me. I don't want to answer. I want to ask you guys to answer. So if you have something to say to the question, I would invite you to put it into the chat box. But my response to that is, yes, I don't think that's the wholly, but I do believe that in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly here, our culture in the US, is the idea of suffering is, and wanting to avoid it, or even labeling it as it's a bad thing, I've done something wrong, then part of that, I believe, is Western Hemisphere and our how we think, in the West, and that not being raised in a way that recognizing that life happens, that if something is birthed, what's also birthed is its death, right? And we tend to forget that there is this life cycle. And so just as every inhale has to have an exhale, like you can never just inhale, there's always the exhale part of it. And so for Brian's question about viewing God as only love, I'm not sure. I think that adds to it. I think that if I view God or the divine or spirit, the cosmos, ultimate reality, whatever language we have for it, as only that, I think it has the potential to move us into spiritual bypass. But God is just love. So why is this happening over here? And I just have to focus on this, and that will make the pain and ick go away. But I don't think I think some people have an idea of God as love, but it's a kind of a capital L, and not the human love kind of idea. But that's a great question. Dorothy asked if spiritual bypassing is a defense mechanism, is it conscious or unconscious? And my answer to that would be yes. I think we do both. I think it's unconscious. So we have unconscious habits, right? We've learned some unconscious habits. We've learned that we've been taught how to deal with our pain. We've been taught that when something's painful, most of us have been taught when something's painful, I need to get away from it. I need to run away. What do I need to do? What do I, how do I make this stop? How do I, I joke with students that I have that, when we're kind of in the dark, and by in the dark, I mean, we have painful things in life. There's, challenges with parents, challenges with siblings, there's death, there's illness, there's job loss, there's, financial insecurities, there's food insecurity, there's housing insecurity, there's lots of things, and some of those are some of the big ones, and certainly there's smaller ones. But when we're in these big things and with these pain, with pain and grief and sadness and suffering, we tend to think that quick, I have to run around and find the light switch to turn on the light. We haven't always learned that maybe to just pause and that there's something to be learned in the quote unquote dark. Now, of course, we don't want to live there, but who wants to be uncomfortable? Who wants to be in pain, right? Nobody. So spiritual bypassing is a way to, what's my spiritual practice to get me, one, to heal the pain. This is where it can get a little, where it can get, the lines can get fuzzy, is that I can use a spiritual practice to completely avoid the pain, and yet the same spiritual practice will also help me bring healing and wholeness and relief, right? And from the pain. So, for instance, in my affiliation is Unity, and Unity is founded on prayer. And this doesn't just happen in Unity. I've seen it happen in other traditions. But because a lot of my work is within Unity churches around the country, one thing I've noticed is when there is conflict going on, somebody, when the tension starts to build, right? Raise your hand if you like conflict, right? And conflict comes in a lot of different forms, but it's that internal tension, and we start to feel it, and we immediately want to, how do I make it stop? Like, make it stop. I don't want to, the tension. And so often what I have found in working with faith-based organizations, churches often, is the minute there's conflict, somebody will go, we need to pray. And which stops the conflict. Like, we need to stop and pray, which is a way of how do we make this stop and not feel the tension. And that is it's our intention to get it to avoid or to escape rather than be with the tension. So, yeah. So that's an example of, what was it? Conscious or unconscious. So that's a both and, in terms of where we are unconsciously wired to avoid pain, and yet we can consciously choose a spiritual practice to avoid the pain. And it may be the same spiritual practice that helps ease the pain, but what makes it the difference between whether it's spiritual bypass or my practice is, am I trying to avoid? Am I trying to escape? Am I trying to get around? Am I trying to just, I can, just, if I put enough pink frosting on it, then it'll be okay. It's the rose-colored glasses thing. Wow, this is great. I don't even have to just ask questions, and people are asking questions. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dorothy. A lot is unconscious, because we want to bypass the pain. We want to, it's a defense mechanism. That's when it becomes spiritual bypassing, is when we use it as a defense mechanism. Let's see. Yep. So let me ask you guys this, and you can, if you want, you can also speak. You don't have to just type in the chat box. You can turn on your mic. Are they unmuted, Geneva?
They're all muted right now, but they're welcome to unmute themselves if.
Okay. So what I have a list of effects of spiritual bypassing. I would ask you what you think might be some of the effects of spiritual bypassing. And feel free to turn on your mic and say. Okay. Well,
Hello, can you hear
yeah,
me?
yes,
My name's Nancy. Sometimes I think spiritual bypassing can lead to a sense of arrogance in that you're somehow better than because you're not involved with the dirty stuff of life. You're somehow on another plane. Does that make any sense?
yes, yep, absolutely.
I think it's also a form of denial that you actually don't deal with the problem.
Mhm.
You put it in some sphere above in the spiritual, but it's a work that you actually need to do, not somebody else. That's you need to do. And we forget that sometimes.
Right. Yeah, it is a denial tactic. There's different kinds of spiritual bypass. There's so I'm gonna bring the slide back up. So well, let me answer this question. Margit, I don't know if I'm saying your
Target,
name.
yes. It's a
Okay.
German name.
Yeah. Do you really heal pain and loss, or do you integrate it as part of life as the real task? Well, my answer to that would be yes. That for me, integrating is a form of healing. But there's always like the loss of a loved one. There's always the loss, but we integrate the loss into our life and live with it and create a new landscape. But spiritual bypass can be a way to just avoid that altogether and have it be, whatever's going on in life, let me put it on the shelf and ignore it. And how do I make it stop and make it go away? So I'm gonna bring up I got a slide, and it's about using spiritual, and I'm doing this in the specific context of racism, because there are, if you're awake at all in the America right now, there are a few big issues going on, big topics, big challenges in living this human condition, living this human, living our lives here. And racism is one of them. That we are, coming to a place, not coming to, we're at a place that we have a lot of work to do, but spiritual bypassing is often used as a way to disengage from talking about race. Or so I have a couple. Where's there? So some examples of spiritual bypassing when it comes to race. So how would, and you can pick any of these, but I'm going to run down a few. So unity over division. So people, in spiritual communities, we may hear, we don't want to talk about race, racism or systemic racism or racial justice or, any inequities because it's divisive. And if something is divisive, then it's outside our bubble of what we decide or what we believe is spiritual. That's one way of, that's a form of spiritual bypassing. When we talk about oneness, if you've heard that, and this can be difficult for some people that say, well, I don't see color, we're all one. That's actually spiritual bypassing, because it's negating the color of another person. But in our intention is to practice oneness and to engage with oneness, and so and to acknowledge that and be with that. Another spiritual bypass is transcendence. We let's focus on God or love. That came up a little earlier, or world peace. And there's different ways of using spiritual language or spiritual practices to bypass something that's really difficult, that's really painful, that's challenging for many people to talk about, especially if you're just learning yourself about something that's so, that's so challenging. One of the ones that makes me the most crazy is that last one, fatalism. Maybe this is what you signed up for in a previous life. I'm like, really? Like, how is that helpful? It's not helpful. How do we, so, all right. Yes, Jan says in the topic, we're all one, but which one are you? Which one are you? So, there are different kinds of bypassing. So I'm kind of, circling around a little bit. There is the optimistic bypass. You want to guess what that sounds like?
It's all good. Everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
All is well.
Focus on the positive. Don't let that frown get you down. It's very, very optimistic. It's when we are really, yes, everything is just as it should be. Yep. Everything is in divine order. Everything is, when it's used to really, when I'm anger phobic, right? When I just really, really, I'm just so phobic about anger. And I just, for some people, it's really challenging because if you grew up in a home that had a lot of anger, you can feel yourself triggered when someone gets angry. And so being an optimistic bypass is one that we hear a lot, the more challenging something is. When someone tells you to see the glass is half full, kind of thing. And again, the irony of spiritual bypassing is that it's not that these statements aren't true. I want to focus on the positive, and yet, why am I using this? Why am I saying that? So another kind of bypass is called aggrandizement. And aggrandizement bypass is a way that it's adopted by people who, to feel enlightened, or, I've reached a higher plane of existence, or, being, enlightened, or spiritual guru, or sort of, I'm a, what's the word I hear? I'm a mystic now, and spiritual, my soul has been spiritually awakened. So again, and then there's the victim bypass. The victim bypass is someone who, when you become, actually they say, as a victim of your own gifts or of other people, it takes away the pressure of the responsibility for shaping, my own life and taking responsibility for my own happiness, instead of putting it off on someone else. Like sometimes I hear someone identifies as an empath, and I've heard it, not just identifying as an empath, but then using that as a reason to, I put it out on other people because I'm an empath. I have to avoid other people, and I have to avoid, particular kinds of people or particular kinds of situations. And that can sometimes be a little bit of a victim bypass trap, as opposed to learning how to be in difficult situations. And I'm going to talk about how to disengage, when you find yourself in, practicing a spiritual bypass. So Michelle asked the question, what's wrong with positive bypassing though? So the problem with bypassing itself is that you're avoiding a painful situations and painful challenges where you're avoiding or suppressing, or just, how do I make this go away? So it's not so much about not being positive. I want to be positive. I want to think positive things and have a positive attitude. It's when we use the positivity to avoid the pain, the difficulty, the challenge, instead of being with it. And it's not always easy to be with it. I think if we use prayer or positive perspective statements to avoid feeling something or shutting down the conversation, shutting down a conversation, it's a very quick way to that positive optimist bypass is really a good way to shut down a conversation. Someone is, talking about the difficulties they're having, and they, and I say something, well, there's this, here's, I just give you a bunch of positive statements. The glass is half full, and, just everything will be better in the morning. Go out into the sunshine, you'll feel better. And, God's always present. You don't have to, so it's just a redirect is what happens, why that's called a bypass. So in the chat box, I just put, I'm running down a list of different kinds of bypassing. And so in the chat, you can see I'm running down 10 different kinds. I'm sure there's more. So the psychonaut bypass is using psychedelic drugs for to just escape, to expand the mind, to expand our perception of existence, to, like any drug, it can be used as a way to escape reality and avoid, committing to doing the work. There's the horoscope bypass, which is not necessarily just about the horoscope, but looking outside of ourselves for help or guidance, as a way to avoid. You have to keep in mind, it's always about a way. Am I doing this to avoid? Am I doing this to escape? Am I doing this to deny? So of course we do from time to time look outside ourselves for help, right? I do. I have people that I turn to for help and support, but it's not so I can avoid something, but rather to help me through the challenge. That's why, I keep saying that there's, our spiritual practices, pushed to an extreme, can become a crutch and a way to avoid. And yet it's the same practices that will, quote unquote, save us. The horoscope bypass is when we do look outside ourselves and, or whether the horoscope, what does my horoscope say? Or, relying solely on the horoscope, or solely on a psychic, or solely on someone else's experience, or solely on, external information or external predictions. Again, it's that we don't trust ourselves, and it comes from being afraid that can I be in this difficulty? Can I be in this challenge? Then there's the saint bypass. As kids, we're conditioned to believe that a spiritual person is someone that's always kind, that's compassionate, that's saintly. And then, as we grow into adulthood, the saint bypass can almost become a black and white thinking kind of thing. That if we're having difficulty or challenges or dark thoughts or, darker feelings or, feelings that are, I don't like to call feelings positive or negative, because I think they all give us information, but the saint bypass, what happens is as we grow older, we've become conditioned that if I'm angry, frustrated, irritated, annoyed, resentful, then I've done something wrong, right? Then I'm not being spiritual. I hear this a lot out of actually spiritual leaders and pastors, that if I'm, not always sort of saintly, then I'm not being spiritual. And it just isn't so. And a byproduct of that, so there was a question earlier, is what are some of the consequences of it? Well, one of them, in this case, the saint bypass, is that that a person, you can really self-sacrifice to an extreme, by thinking that if I'm thinking these quote unquote negative thoughts and having feelings of anger or frustration or, just overwhelm and sadness and grief, and that I must not be being spiritual. So I better go practice my spiritual practice a whole lot more to make it go away, rather than just pausing and acknowledging what you are thinking, what you are feeling. Then there's the spirit guide bypass. In some spiritual traditions, it's a God that protects, and others it could be an angel, it could be an animal guide, a spirit guide, whatever that is. Again, I'm not poking at spirit guides. It's that, when we are solely or largely connected to that as a way to avoid, where we put all of our energy and we place all of our faith, into another being power, another being's direction, another being's, that it's putting responsibility outside of ourselves largely. And if I can avoid the responsibility, hopefully I can sidestep, the work that I need to do. And now what happens, the unintended consequence of that by sidestepping is I don't build my own resilience. I don't build my own spiritual strength, right? I don't learn to trust myself, right? And to trust my own intuition, to trust my own faith tradition, to trust my own life philosophy, to trust my values, to trust my higher self. There's the prayer bypass, which I mentioned earlier, that again, praying becomes, of course, is a healthy practice in whatever form you use. And we can also, oh, I'm uncomfortable, got to go pray. If I, I'll pray it away. And then there's the guru bypass. Again, it's very similar to the spirit guide bypass, where of course, we have spiritual teachers, and we may have a shaman or a guru or, a rabbi or a pastor or someone that is our spiritual teacher that we want to have, that we want to learn from and we want to grow with. But it's when we become so attached to, again, that outside person, and relinquishing our own responsibility and relinquishing our own understanding. We forget to listen to what the teachings are and integrate those. Instead, we just sort of close our eyes and, well, my teacher said it, so it must be so. And then there's the finger pointing bypass, which is just, sometimes I think this one is very much alive now, and I've been guilty of all of these, by the way, but where we point that everything's just wrong. I had earlier in this past week, it was like midweek, I had one of those days where I just pointed to everything. Everything was wrong with my world. That's what's wrong with me, right? You're what's wrong with me. This going on is what's wrong in my life, and this person over here, and this government official over there, and this friend over here, and it just I just wanted to let me just get to my car and drive away off into the sunset, and I'll live in my car. Not realizing that everywhere I go, there I am. But at its roots, the finger pointing is again another source of fear, another source of, it's coming from fear, it's coming from avoidance. And there are other forms of spiritual bypassing as well. So, Gard Jameson says, they all seem to have our egos as the primary reference rather than the other. Our own self-esteem, our own safety and security, our own control, evolutionary reactions to threat or fear that we're not capable to truly being there for the other. Yeah, there is a lot. And what I would say in terms of, it does have, yes, largely to do with our ego, and I would say our immature ego, because I happen to believe we need our ego to navigate this three-dimensional world. And what I think most of us are working on in our spiritual world, and whatever our spiritual practices are, is to grow up our ego, right? To have a healthy, a mature ego as opposed to, immature ego or an adverse ego that is responding to the fear, and you have to avoid. It's almost like that, that danger, there's something going on, the part of the brain that's the amygdala that knows there's danger and it's not safe is going to get us to engage in some kind of spiritual bypass practice in order to make the discomfort go away. So how do I shift out of discomfort and into having comfort? So building on what Gard mentioned, is the opposite of spiritual bypassing spiritual empathy. Well, I think in part, Brian, yes. So let me pause here again. I want to, where I'm going to go next is about how to stop spiritual bypassing, or, the other practices that we take on. But let me pause there because I've been talking a lot. Questions? Anyone want to say anything out loud? Okay. So I think actually what I'm going to do is, oh, you don't have, I don't see small groups, so we won't do that. Okay. So what I do want to get to is talking about ways to kind of avoid, or not avoid, but practices to re-engage, right? When we've engaged in spiritual bypassing, which is our using a spiritual practice or spiritual language to avoid discomfort, to suppress, to escape, pain and discomfort and tension, whatever words you want to use. So how do we then re-engage? And we want to re-engage, with the world. We want to re-engage with life. We want to re-engage and move into what needs healing, to move into taking care of what's called our shadow work, right? So that we can be expressing our most noble self. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm navigating a question. All right. Okay. So what I just now put in the chat, and I will, what I'll do is I'll put that on a slide as well. Oh, made me a host. Okay, so I want to take, I definitely want to, sorry, having a brain cloud for a minute. I want to talk about the practices, right, for shifting out of spiritual bypassing, and that will engage us into our spiritual growth. And let me bring that slide up here. There. Okay. So the first one is when, and all of this is really, and this is sort of a drive-by, right? So we're here for an hour or a little over an hour, and it's really a drive-by into a bigger, a longer conversation, a deeper conversation, a practice of self-awareness, right? So it's not like we learn about spiritual bypass and then, okay, all done. It's really an ongoing practice. And so one of the first practices to disengage from spiritual bypassing, and it's always coming from a place of being aware that you are engaged in spiritual bypass. But the first thing is cultivating an open-minded attitude. And what that means is noticing, this is the self-awareness part, right? Of noticing when there's tension, when you're avoiding anger, when you realize that you need to be right? That's kind of a big one. I need to be right. But really what we need is to be open, willing to be misguided, willing to, just willingness, and really acknowledging that, I'm off base on that one. And wow, I didn't realize I was just totally trying to avoid, or just really wanting to be right. But cultivating an open-minded attitude is really a willingness attitude, remind yourself every day that it's okay to be imperfect. Remind yourself that, every spiritual seeker I know is, always walking that I'm imperfect, that I'm perfectly imperfect, right? And I know that there are many facets about me that are just okay, and there's a few that's a little rough around the edges, and that may be different every day. But we all go astray at some point. But it's embracing our flawed humanity and just cultivating, being willing to step into greater expansion, a greater understanding, and being willing to, okay, this is really uncomfortable, but I'm willing to be in this, discomfort, and that you don't have to do that alone either. So the second one is examining the light and the dark side of what we do. So there is a light and a dark side to everything. If you struggle to find what's wrong with some spiritual activity or commitments that you're dedicated to, create some hypothetical scenarios. For example, if you have a particular spiritual teacher that you love, that you adore, then create a hypothetical scenario where, a possibility of where the teacher might betray your trust and does something against, what you hold to be ethically correct. Like, what then would you do? What could go wrong here? What am I not seeing? Or, what's the other side of this? So it's not, and again, this, doing this one, examining the light and dark side of what you do and creating some hypothetical scenarios is just a way for you to discover how tightly you're holding on to, in this case scenario, I said, if you have a particular spiritual teacher, how tightly I'm holding on to something, and can I loosen the grip just a little bit? What warnings do people give, about a particular activity, or, how am I taking a look at how dependent am I on a particular teaching or on a particular spiritual teacher or following a particular way? Again, I got to reiterate, it's not about not being dependent. It's taking a look at it to see, am I overly dependent? Am I dependent to the extent that I'm relinquishing my own self-responsibility and my own self-reliance? Listen to the doubt. Blind faith creates sheep, right? Some of us have heard that line. And what we want is a little bit more of self-sovereignty. Dare to look at both sides of life. It's the yin and the yang, right, of our existence. The third one is dare to face your cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is, if you're not familiar with the term, is where a person's beliefs and the behaviors don't align. It also happens when someone's trying to hold two contradictory beliefs. So I may, a cognitive dissonance can happen when I believe, I say one thing, but my behavior doesn't match what I'm doing. And it's just about facing the truth. And we engage in spiritual bypass so that I can avoid the reality. It's sort of like I myself have experienced, and I know others too, that somewhere along the line in my spiritual journey, my favorite spiritual teacher fell off their pedestal and there was a really loud thump. And all of a sudden, and I realized that how I had held them, I was thinking about them in a particular way, but then their behavior, I started to see, and it wasn't like they were doing anything horribly wrong. It was just, I started to see them, oh, they're human, right? Oh, yeah, they make mistakes. Oh, they're not, and the cognitive dissonance was that, oh, they're human, but I liked them in that little nice pedestal, because then I could just follow what they said or what they did. So it's learning to face the cognitive dissonance, where, the language and the behavior doesn't line up within ourselves and with others. And again, it's not about shaming ourselves, or it's not about trying to be perfect. It's just about cleaning out the self-delusion. It's about clearing out and just being honest. Another thing is ask others for their honest opinions. So not everybody wants to do that. Be careful who you ask, because if you don't want the honest opinion, don't ask that person. But again, and coming back to the ego conversation, if I'm going to ask someone for an honest opinion about something, then like asking them if they've noticed any spiritual bypassing tendencies, within you, you just kind of have to brace yourself that they may give you an answer that you don't particularly care for, or you may get an answer and find yourself overwhelmed with, being defensive, or being annoyed at them. But again, it's just information it's feedback to take in and to just, discern. Is there truth in what they're saying? Am I trying to avoid, escape, or, put on another layer of pink frosting because I'm uncomfortable with a particular topic? I'm uncomfortable with a painful experience in my life. But just know who you're asking. And if you don't have someone that you would ask that kind of question of, then maybe find a spiritual counselor or someone else who's familiar with spiritual bypassing. And then the last one is to face and feel your pain. Why does spiritual bypassing occur? Because it helps us avoid facing painful emotions like shame, like rage, like hatred, like anger. Everyone I know, including me, I'd much rather have a sparkly, spiritual high, and I'd much rather have a sparkly, love and light day, and just long lasting eternal joy and fulfillment and peace. And the reality for me is that that's just not my everyday world. Of course I have those days, of course I have those moments, but feeling our pain is a part of that journey, and it's not always simple, depending on the type of painful emotions we're having. It could be something really big that requires some a counselor, a professional counselor, or there's just, we have pieces, I call them unlived, unloved pieces of ourselves, sort of tucked in corners of our mind and kind of in our body in different places. And so to face and feel your pain, and none of these really are meant to be all to do on your own. We do this world and this life together. So find people that you love, find people that you trust, and do this work together, because the by engaging in spiritual bypass practices, we have lots of unintended consequences. And I know that someone put in excuse me, put in the chat box asking for some of the effects. So I will pull that up in just a moment. So Gard says, it feels like we're engaged in a massive bypassing right now. Yeah, spiritually, politically, economically, socially, as Jung suggests. It's time to withdraw our projections. My experience suggests that some kind of contemplative practice is also important to getting past the delusion, a never-ending adventure. Amen. You should have the mic, Gard. He's like, no. But yes, I agree 100% that absolutely. So I didn't have it on my list, but a contemplative practice, and a contemplative practice can look a lot of different ways. It could be, what's called centering prayer. It could be vipassana, a kind of meditation. It can be a walking meditation. If you have, a walking trail in nature, where you're just, you're silent, you're not talking to anyone, you're just, walking. It can be just sitting quietly in your home where you are. Light a candle. A powerful practice for me is actually light a candle or something that's just maybe a foot or so out in front of me, that I just gaze at it. And that's all I do. I don't talk. I just gaze at, say, the candle. And of course, if you're like me, you have a monkey mind that'll start. It's like a hamster wheel in the brain. The monkey mind starts chattering about all the things that are going on in the world or going on in life. And how do I not do this? And how do I got to take care of that. I got to, right? That's why it's called monkey mind, because it's chatter. But just to focus on the one thing in front of me. And when I find the chatter, come back to the one thing. There are many, many, many contemplative practices. And I would encourage you to use Dr. Google. You could just type in contemplative practices in Google, and you'll get, if you don't have a contemplative practice, which is a contemplative practice is a quieting, right? To quiet the mind, quiet the body, still the emotions. Again, not to make them go away, but to just to be able to ground yourself so that you have the capacity to not spiritually bypass. So you have the capacity to engage in, all the challenges sitting in front of us right now. So there are some signs of spiritual bypassing, which I did not get into a slide. So let me do that real quick for you. So there is another question there. Can't we move beyond spiritual practices and contemplation into action by working to increase the self-esteem, safety, and control of others, especially when Black Lives Matter? So that's a great question. And what I would actually say is that it's not, so here's the interesting thing about that. When you say spiritual practices is, how do you define spirituality? Like and which I did not do at the beginning. I got an hour over an hour. But to define spirituality, and it's a very personal thing, right? It isn't necessarily connected to a particular faith tradition or religion, but a spiritual practice is, how you do practices that engage your spiritual nature. So, and that's kind of for you to name what that is. I don't think we move beyond spiritual practices and contemplation. What I believe is that you need them both. You need contemplation and action because they inform each other, right? Like when I spend time in a contemplative practice, then I'm connected to myself, connected to source. I'm grounded. I have greater clarity in my thinking, in my feelings. I'm more likely to engage in I'm more likely to engage rather than a spiritual bypass practice. And so the action becomes informed by my contemplative practice because my contemplative practice is designed to ground me, to just sort of clear out the monkey mind, right? The chatter. So for me, it's both. Dorothy, it's contemplation and action, right? For me, every spiritual truth is a paradox, and that's one of those, and engaging in both, because you can overdo both, right? If I spend all my time and energy in contemplation, I'm just sort of this bliss ninny, right? If I spend all of my energy and time in being active and action, I get burnt out, right? And I'm really become just not that fun to be around. And so it requires both, right? So I do this, it's this energy system, and I dance between both, recognizing that I need them both for my wholeness. I need them both for my growth, for my development, so that I can make a difference in my world. Because ultimately, that wanting to show up as my most noble self is what happens when I do engage in both. And the more I spend actually in contemplation, there is the potential for the more likely to engage in spiritual bypass. So let me get some of these, what I said, these consequences of engaging in spiritual bypass. Let me get these into bullet for you. All right, so let's share the screen. Okay, so not focusing on the here and now, living in spiritual realm much of the time. That's that sort of bliss ninny that I was just poking at. Overemphasizing the positive and avoiding the negative. Again, we touched on that a little bit. And I don't know that I would, most people understand the word positive and negative, but I would say like life affirming, what I would call positive would be life affirming, but this is that positive bypass. Being self-righteous about the concept of enlightenment, right? When we start to hear that, for instance, I have one, if someone calls themselves a mystic, then I'm kind of like, really? Because I would think that a mystic doesn't actually call themselves a mystic. Like you wouldn't necessarily know, but I don't know. But that's one of my, I have to check in with that. But you know, when things are difficult and tension and difficulty, and there's out of my voice mouth or someone else's, that we just have to get to the top of the mountain. We need to be enlightened. We need to do this and to ascend. And I'm like, yeah, but life is right here, not at the top of the mountain. Being overly detached, being overly idealistic, the feelings of entitlement, either exhibiting frequent anger or completely avoiding anger. The cognitive dissonance that I talked about early, being overly quote unquote compassionate. I put compassionate in quotes because I think true compassion you can't do overly, but if you know, you can burn out, right? I was talking about the burnout, and pretending that everything is okay when it's not. There are things going on that are just not okay. My spiritual practice, though, so when I am really engaged and everything is, you know, okay, of course, and the other one too, the finger pointing, everything is not okay. When I'm at an extreme, you know, I need to pause and then engage back into life and do one of those things that, you know, cultivating an open and willing mind, you know, a contemplative practice to, you know, ask for help from people, to get feedback. Okay. So it's 5:08. I don't know if I went too long. If there's questions, comments, that was a total drive-by. I feel like I just.
No, thank you so much for your wisdom and for this engaging conversation. I know a lot of people have already asked questions, but if anybody has any additional questions or comments that they'd like to present, feel free to unmute yourselves.
Kelly, thank you so much. As I say, I enjoyed this when you gave it at the Parliament. It's a really important teaching, especially right now. You know, there's so much divisiveness, and I think the only thing that gets us past that is a quality of authenticity, and that's what you're calling for.
Yes.
And I put a website there, contemplativelife.org, which has contemplative practices from all over the planet.
Great.
I'm Jeff Janungu.
I don't see it in the chat. Oh, there, I see it.
Contemplativelife.org.
Yep, I
A
got it.
wonderful place if you're curious about contemplative practices. And there's a contemplative kind of weed map. You can find contemplative centers in your backyard there if you just put it in wherever you live.
I have a chapel that I visit on Saturday afternoons, and there's about a dozen of us that enter into this chapel for contemplative practice. Yeah.
We need more of that. So keep doing that. That's so important.
Yep. Well, thank you. Few of you, it's nice to see you. Jan, hi. And Geneva, it's nice to see you.
Of course, always a pleasure. And it's good to see you, Gard. Glad you could join us.
Yeah.
Were there any other last questions or comments?
I
It's
just
an
want to
ongoing conversation.
Sorry, what?
Eva's just been appointed to the Global Trustees for United Religions Initiative. So
Yep.
I'm really excited about what you can bring to that because you bring a lot of wisdom. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Gard.
Yeah, we miss her here in Kansas City. Okay.
I still try to be present everywhere I can.
I know.
Zoom
So-
has helped. Right?
Yeah, just reminder that it is, you know, the idea of spiritual bypassing is noticing, it's a self-awareness practice, noticing when we're engaging it to avoid, you know, and avoid our own pain and suffering. So, and to disengage from it allows you to show up as your most noble, authentic self, which is what the world needs. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
great
much, Jeff.
day.
Appreciate
Thank
you
you
all
very
for
much.
joining us. And thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for your time and for all of you to spend your afternoon with us. I hope you'll join us for future programs. And There will be a recording of this on Facebook and on YouTube later. So if you want to review Kelly's slides or just share the program with your networks, you're welcome to do so. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
You too. Have a great week.
Bye.